Just to give you some background, I'm writing from the viewpoint of an 8-year-old because that's the age I was approximately at that time. It's set in the early 1960s, and it's located in a place between Whitehorse and Dawson City in the Yukon Territory. Now, Tales of the Yukon, in my generation at least, have to include several parts. One is a last frontier. One is a very colorful Indigenous person, a very colorful white person, and also a battle against the elements. Oh, and a disclaimer. I'm writing in the language of the time, so I use the term Indian, and at some point I refer to half-breed because that was a term that was used at the time. So the first story falls into the last frontier category. When I was a really little kid, before I went to school, I lived at Minto. My dad has a company, and it is called Nighthawk Lumber. Dad says we cut logs for United Keno Hill Mine. That's what they put in the mine, so it doesn't fall down and kill the miners. I really liked it at Minto because I got to follow the men all around until it was time for them to work for Dad. Dad has lots of friends, and I had lots of friends, and I got to visit all over the place. But there were some scary times too. Pete is the best person who works for Dad. He is a sawyer who runs the sawmill. He taught me to blow my nose Yukon style. You just have to put your fingers over your nose like this. You blow into it, and then you flick it or you wipe it on your pants. I did that a lot until my mother found out and said I was getting far, far too coarse. She told me she wrote a letter to my Auntie Babe and said she was worried I was spending way too much time with the men. Well, who else can I talk to? My teenage sisters, Bonnie and Peggy, are in Whitehorse at the convent, and my baby brother he's only a baby. Donnie's only a baby. Some people live across the road in an Indian village. My favorites are Jessie and Louie Wolf. She gives me lots of kisses, and she made me beautiful beaded moccasins. When Bonnie was in town, she told me she would skin me alive if she saw me walking out on the coarse gravel with those moccasins, because that, as she said, that little woman had to work hours, days to make those moccasins. She had to strip the fur and the guts and the meat off of the hide. Then she had to soak the hide in moose brains to soften it, and then she had to smoke it, and then that was to preserve the hide. And then after that, she spent hours and hours taking little tiny beads and making beautiful flowers on the moccasins. Her husband, Louis, is something called a Métis. That is half Indian and half white. People in the Yukon call that a half-breed, but maybe he has a different name because Louis is from the outside. Everything in the Yukon at the time was, if you were from the outside, that was everything outside the territory. It immediately established you as a foreigner. Louis was a soldier in the war, and he used to wear his uniform and a beret. That's kind of a fancy tam. It's a fancy name for a tam. He would help Father Tongi say the mass. He was an altar server. Nobody else at Minto knew how to do that. One time we got to go to the fish camp at Five Finger Rapids, and we saw all sorts of people camping in tents and smoking salmon over smoky fires. I love smoked salmon. We even have a picture of me and my sisters under a big stick. They're carrying this salmon on a big stick. When we moved to Pelly Crossing, I asked Mom if I could go to the fish camp. She said, no, that was Indian business. I don't know why I can't go now when I used to go before, but she's not telling me. There was a sad time when people from the fish camp came to stay at Minto. A baby was screaming and screaming so much that everyone was scared. We have a nurse who comes from Whitehorse to give medicine to people and help with lots of hurts. I always go with her when she visits the village. I liked it a lot because I got to play with the kids, but I didn't like it the time the baby was screaming. The nurse and me, we looked into the tent and saw the baby, who wouldn't stop crying, and her face was all red. She was lying under some smoked meat, and then the nurse grabbed the baby. She saw something. She took a little knife and she cut the baby's skin. The baby shouted more, and then she pulled out a horrible worm. Oh, ugh. The nurse shouted at the mother, "This is what happens when you leave a child under raw meat. What kind of a dirty, dirty person does this to a helpless child?" The nurse's face was really angry. The mother looked really worried. I didn't want to be with the nurse in the village anymore. I wanted to go home and see my mom. There were other scary things. Indian people couldn't go into the bars to drink. So one time Joe went to Whitehorse. Joe was our friend, and he bought some booze from a bootlegger. Those are people who do sneaky things. This bad person sold him something called grain alcohol instead of the whiskey he wanted, and that made Joe go crazy. One day, Mom said Joe couldn't take it anymore. We heard a shot across the road. Dad and some men ran over with a babiche stretcher. That's made of moose gut that you carry. You carry sick people in that. Dad and the man had to get Joe's body out of his cabin before his wife and kids got back from berry picking. Mom says Joe sent his family away so they wouldn't see the bad thing. Dad says he'd like to find the bastard, that's a bad word, who sold Joe the bad booze and give him a taste of his own medicine. I wonder what that means. I hope that it's a really bad punishment. Sometimes I wish I was still a little kid at Minto and got to visit the man who worked for Dad. Even if there were scary times, I still had Jessie who loved me, and I could go over to the Indian village and play with all the kids. The second story is about a really interesting character. She, at a time where the Indigenous women were really, really shy and gentle and very quiet, this woman was not. She took up a lot of space and she was completely unapologetic, which makes her a marvelous person to write about. I call this story Mary, Two Men and a Baby. Dad's face is bright red. He was teasing Mary about her new baby. She'd come to the kitchen door asking for Dad because she needed to register for family allowance. Dad has a lot of jobs. One of them is Justice of the Peace. That means he can help Mary get money for her baby. No one thought Mary could have a baby because she's very, very old. She's 46, but she's holding a cute little kid. So I guess people were wrong. Dad was laughing with her and said, "Hey, what's this? You and Joseph, another baby?" He looked over at Mom, winked and said, "I guess it's never too late." And then Mary said, "That's not Joseph, baby. That's Harry, baby." That's when Dad's face really got red. "Oh," he said in a quiet voice, and grabbed some papers and started to fill them out. When Mary left, Dad said to Mom, "Christ, I walked into that one." "Well, you didn't mean any harm," Mom said. "I guess this shouldn't surprise us," Dad said. "Mary is a woman with a big appetite for men, booze, and grub." There have been stories going around that Mary moved Harry into their cabin and forced Joseph to live in the meat cache. A meat cache is like a cabin, but it's up on poles. And on the bottom, they have tin cans. It's because you put the meat up there, you keep it cool and no animals can get it. And they put tin cans all around the bottom of those legs because then a bear or something can't claw their way up and eat your meat. As for Harry, I don't like Harry. He has a skinny mustache like the bad guys in the movies. Those are the guys that steal good women from good husbands. We like Joseph. He's a big, gentle man. He wears a tweed cap and overalls like farmers in Alberta. And he wears moccasins, everyday moccasins on his feet. Those are the ones with the purple, they have purple on them and no beads. When he walks, he kind of rolls from side to side like that. He used to work on the ferry. So Mom and Dad say he's a good provider and his family lives well. Our friend Dolly Blackshack walks into the kitchen door right after Mary leaves. Mom and Dad ask if the stories about Mary and the two men are true. And she says, "Those people are so crazy." So Joseph is living in the meat cache and Harry is living in Mary's bed? Aren't people shocked? Dad asked with a laugh. Yes, they are. I guess Joseph will live there until winter comes and then maybe he'll have to live in the cabin too, Dolly says. She tells Mom and Dad that some of the men wanted Joseph to throw Harry out of the cabin, but Joseph is older and not in good shape. The women tried to talk to Mary, but we all know Mary does what Mary wants, and that's all there is to it. There's still some things I don't understand about this story. Why would Harry want to live in a bed? And why does Joseph look so happy if he's been thrown out of his own cabin and he's living in a meat cache. Joseph was a wise man. Mary was hell on wheels. The third, this includes this is a story about one of the colorful 5% in the Yukon. And in honor of the Queen's Jubilee, I thought I'd throw in a royal visit. This is called Prince Philip Meets Moses. They started to call him Moses. He does look like that man in the movie, The 10 Commandments. Like the scary part when he brought the tablets down from the mountain and found his people drunk and falling all around, with women rolling about with their legs sticking up. I bet he wished he left them in Egypt, where the bad Pharaoh could have them whipped and get them to drag around those big stones. I asked Dad if he really is Moses. He said, no, that's a made-up story because Armstrong has long bushy hair and a big beard, and he likes to tell people how to save their souls. Dad says he's really someone else, and he shows me an old picture of a really handsome man with a nice haircut and no beard. He says, you'll never believe this, Sheilagh, but this was Armstrong. His name is really Irwin Regerson Armstrong, and he was raised the same way I was, a staunch Presbyterian. Armstrong told Dad that he was married to a woman who came from a royal family, and he took her to a homestead in Ontario to work out her salvation. Armstrong loves working out your salvation. After listening to the tale, Dad says it sounded like the house was rat infested and had a basement full of water. They had 7 kids before she finally just packed up and left. Armstrong doesn't seem to worry about his kids or where they are. If he didn't notice rats or a flood, maybe he doesn't really know that they're gone. Maybe he's looking for a new wife. Protestants can do that. We saw him down at the river with some of the older girls from the village. They were splashing around in the sunshine and looked really happy. So maybe he's not so bad once he washes up. He moved down the road a bit, and he was living in an old pioneer cabin with a sod roof. It was falling down and had a lot of ventilation, something Armstrong really likes for his salvation. He'll cut holes in the roof if he doesn't have ventilation. We stopped by and he came out hugging a couple of the older girls from the river. Dad says, well, maybe he's not so crazy after all. We heard the Queen was coming to Mayo one summer and got really excited about wearing our best dresses and hats and shoes. Dad saw the Queen in England when he was fighting in the war, and he says she's so much prettier than her pictures. Peggy and Bonnie like to hear about Prince Charles. They see pictures of him and his sister, Princess Anne, in some magazines. They think he's dreamy. Ugh. Everyone at the Pelly wanted to see the Queen except Armstrong, who doesn't like citified ways and putting on the dog. Dad tried to get him interested and even said he could drive up with us. That made us mad. We didn't want Armstrong to come unless maybe he took a bath. Just as we were getting to leave, Armstrong said he was going after all and hitched a ride in the back of a dump truck. There was no way we could stop him from showing up all dirty and dusty. It wasn't really great when we got to Mayo. The Queen wasn't even there. She was something called indisposed, and she had to stay in Whitehorse. Mom says that meant she was pregnant with a little boy. His name is Prince Andrew. Everyone from the Pelly and Mayo, they were all standing at the landing strip when the Queen's husband, Prince Philip, flew the plane in. He looked very handsome and he was dressed really nicely. He was walking down the line of grown-ups, shaking hands and saying, how do you do? When all of a sudden, Armstrong stepped forward, all dirty and dusty, and stuck out his hand. He said in a loud voice everyone could hear, I'm the husband to your wife's cousin. The prince stopped for a little bit, looked at Armstrong, shook his hand and said in an Englishy voice like in the movies, oh, how do you do? I wonder why the prince didn't recognize him. Maybe queens and their husbands don't get out of the palaces all that often, and they never meet the people that their cousins marry. It isn't like that in our family. Maybe it was just because the Queen wasn't there, and it was only Prince Philip. I bet the Queen would have recognized Armstrong right off the bat. The last story is a story about man and women against a man and woman against the elements, or against a harsh landscape. The title of the story comes from a book that the female survivor wrote, and it also was I believe it also was the movie title of a movie with Ed Asner and Sally Struthers. Hey, I'm alive. Do you think they're in love? I asked my mother. I've been mooning over two Americans who went down in a plane about 2 months ago. The bush pilot just found them. A bush pilot just found them. Mom and Dad are reading a story in the White Horse Star. The top of the paper says March the 26th, 1963. I'm looking at a picture of a beautiful woman. Her name is Helen Claiborne. I tell Mom that I'm sure the pilot, his name is Ralph Flores, must have fallen in love with her. In love? My mother looks at me like I'm nuts. They were freezing to death. It was minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were out in the open. And that was never going to happen. She's 21 years old. He's 41 with a wife and six kids. I don't think Mom's right. In the movies, people fall in love if they spend lots of time together alone. And I read about it in my sister's Harlequin romances. I can read all the smoochy bits at the end now that I'm getting bigger. We don't get CBC radio way out here at Pelly Crossing. Mom and Dad have been grabbing the papers when the mail truck brings them in, trying to find out if there's any more news. My parents say Helen Claiborne and Ralph Flores set out from Fairbanks in Alaska. They were flying to Fort St. John in BC. They got caught in a snowstorm and crashed into the bush. Mr. Flores is from a place with lots of palm trees called California, and Miss Claiborne is from a great big city called New York. Dad reads that Mr. Flores was working in Fairbanks. He wanted to fly his plane out to see his family. Helen Claiborne paid him $70 to fly with them because she was on a great adventure, a trip around the world. Dad says bush pilots who searched and finally gave up looking for them said it was a miracle they didn't die because they had no food. The only thing they had was 4 cans of sardines, 2 cans of tuna, some fruit cocktail, and some crackers. Yukoners can't believe they ate everything in the first 10 days because they thought people would find them right away. In the bush? The White Horse Star says that after the food ran out, they ended up eating toothpaste and filled themselves up with water. What they would do is they would melt snow, drink the water, and try and keep their stomachs full. It says they lived off their body fat. She lost 40 pounds and he lost 58 pounds. But even worse than them not having any food, Dad says they had no way to build a shelter. No axe, no rifle, no sleeping bags. Christ, they were damn lucky Flores packed a hunting knife and took a few matches along. I guess I still have a dreamy look on my face because Mom says, this isn't a love story, Sheilagh. The papers say the man had 5 broken ribs and a fractured jaw. She has a broken arm and her foot was crushed. She's got gangrene. That means she's going to lose some toes. Everyone thought they were dead, but Dad says Mr. Flores heard a chainsaw at a trapper's cabin miles away. The trappers had just shown up. They hadn't been there before. He went to find some help. He left Miss Claiborne at the plane, but what he did was he made a really smoky fire. He went out into a meadow, stamped out an SOS and a big arrow pointing towards her so that she would be, she wouldn't be, somebody would find her. They got lucky because before he got too far away, heading towards the trapper's cabin, a bush pilot happened to fly over and saw the smoke, the SOS, and a mirror. Mr. Claiborne was actually flashing to let them know they were there. The pilot circled back to check, and they were both rescued by the next day. I look at all the pictures in the paper. She's so beautiful, and she is calling out, "Hey, I'm alive." He looks very serious. So does his wife. There's a picture of them in the hospital room in Whitehorse. Well, all's well that ends well, Mom says happily. Dad answers, not quite. At least for Flores. I see he's in big trouble with the government. He shouldn't have been flying. He turned on an empty fuel tank, was flying too low, couldn't get the plane started again, and he hit a tree and crashed into the bush. I guess Mr. Flores will be punished even more than he already has been, and that's a bad thing. But I still think the worst part was that after all their troubles and all their time together, they didn't even fall in love. A tragedy, a Yukon tragedy. Thank you for listening.